The neon signs outside the frosted window blurred through the endless sleet. Neo-Reykjavik was a city of glass and steam, built over the boiling veins of the earth to survive a winter that never ended. Zoya sat in the darkest corner of an underground tavern, nursing a glass of synthetic gin. Her head throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache. The neural port hidden beneath the dark curls behind her left ear was still hot from the extraction. She had just pulled off the impossible. Hidden within her mind was a locked memory file stolen directly from the executive floor of Vanguard Dynamics. It was worth millions of credits, enough to buy her a one-way ticket to the equatorial sanctuaries. But the person who was supposed to pay her was exactly 22 minutes late. In her line of work, 22 minutes meant someone was dead. Or someone was talking. Zoya tapped her fingers against the sticky metal of the table. She was a memory broker, a ghost in the system who traded in secrets too dangerous to leave on a digital server. She kept her head down, her leather jacket zipped high, and her eyes sharp. The heavy iron door of the tavern swung open, letting in a blast of sub-zero wind. 3 figures stepped inside. They were not her buyers. They wore the matte black armor of Vanguard enforcers, their faces obscured by polarized visors. Zoya did not hesitate. She kicked her table forward, sending her glass shattering against the boots of the lead enforcer. Before they could raise their shock batons, she was already moving, sprinting toward the kitchen doors. A surge of pure adrenaline flooded her system. She shoved past a startled cook, vaulted over a prep station, and slammed her shoulder into the alleyway exit. The cold hit her like a physical blow. The alley was dark, illuminated only by the faint orange glow of geothermal vents hissing steam into the freezing night. Zoya ran, her boots slipping on the icy cobblestones. Her lungs burned. She needed to reach Sector 4, where the sprawling black markets operated beyond Vanguard jurisdiction. Suddenly, a shadow detached itself from the wall ahead. Zoya skidded to a halt, reaching for the stun pistol strapped to her thigh. But before her fingers could even brush the grip, a firm, gloved hand clamped around her wrist. Another hand pressed flat against her chest, slamming her back against the brick wall with terrifying speed and precision. Zoya gasped, the breath knocked out of her. Through the billowing steam, she finally saw the face of her attacker. It was Sigrid. Every underworld operator in Neo-Reykjavik knew the face of Vanguard Dynamics' chief of security. Sigrid was a striking woman with hair the color of frost and eyes like chipped flint. She wore a tailored, silver-trimmed coat that looked entirely too elegant for a filthy back alley. She was notoriously cold, fiercely intelligent, and completely ruthless. "Going somewhere, Zoya?" Sigrid asked, her voice dangerously calm and perfectly steady. Zoya swallowed hard, trying to ignore the sudden electric jolt of proximity. Sigrid was close, too close. Zoya could smell the faint, sharp scent of ozone and bergamot on her collar. "I was just taking a walk," Zoya said, flashing a breathless, defiant smirk. "The air down here does wonders for the pores." Sigrid did not smile. She tightened her grip on Zoya's wrist just enough to make a point, though her touch was surprisingly gentle for someone intending to make an arrest. "You are carrying highly classified corporate data," Sigrid whispered, leaning in slightly. "My men are tearing this district apart looking for you. If they find you, they have orders to extract the data and leave your mind completely erased. You will be an empty shell." Zoya glared at her, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. "So why are you the one pinning me to a wall? Call them over. Collect your bonus." "Because," Sigrid said, her icy gaze softening just a fraction of a percent, The data you stole proves that my superiors are engineering a massive core meltdown. They plan to wipe out the lower sectors to save power for the executives. Zoya froze. The mocking retort died in her throat. You are lying. I am risking my life just by speaking to you, Sigrid replied, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. I tracked your biometric signature myself. I bypassed the security grid. If Vanguard realizes I found you and let you live, I am a dead woman. Zoya searched the taller woman's face. There was no deception in those striking gray eyes. There was only a quiet, desperate urgency. For years, they had been on opposite sides of a brutal corporate war. Sigrid was the law. Zoya was the glitch. But in this narrow, freezing alley, the lines had suddenly blurred. Sigrid slowly released Zoya's wrist, taking half a step back to give her space. The loss of contact made Zoya shiver in the cold air. I need your help, Sigrid said softly, laying her pride bare. You have the proof locked in your head, and you have the underworld connections to broadcast it. I have the security clearance to get us to the main broadcast tower. We can stop them. Together. Zoya crossed her arms, trying to mask the fact that her hands were trembling. Partnering with a Vanguard executive was suicide. Partnering with a woman who made her pulse race for all the wrong reasons was even worse. If I do this, Zoya said, narrowing her eyes, we split the bounty on the broadcast 50-50, and you promise not to arrest me when it is over. A tiny, almost imperceptible smile tugged at the corner of Sigrid's lips. It transformed her entire face, making Zoya's breath hitch in her throat. I promise not to arrest you, Sigrid agreed softly. But as for the money, you will have to negotiate with me when we survive the night. Do we have a deal? Zoya looked into the stormy depths of Sigrid's eyes. The wind howled through the alley, carrying the distant sound of enforcer sirens. There was no going back to her old life. She reached out, sliding her bare hand into Sigrid's leather-gloved palm. We have a deal, Chief, Zoya murmured. Now get us out of here before your goons turn us both into target practice. Sigrid did not waste a single second. She turned sharply, her silver-trimmed coat sweeping through the frozen mist, and beckoned Zoya to follow. They moved like phantoms through the labyrinth of Sector 4, navigating a chaotic web of rusted steam pipes and crumbling brickwork. Zoya kept her eyes locked on the broad line of Sigrid's shoulders. Trusting the very woman who had spent the last 3 years trying to put a bullet in her back. The howling wind masked the sound of their footsteps. Every few minutes, the blinding white glare of a Vanguard search drone swept across the alleyways above them. Whenever the intense light cut through the shadows, Sigrid would grab Zoya by the arm, pulling her tight against the freezing walls. During one of those agonizing pauses, pressed chest to chest in a narrow alcove, Zoya could feel the steady, rhythmic thrum of Sigrid's heartbeat. It was maddeningly calm. You do not panic, do you? Zoya whispered, her breath ghosting across the collar of Sigrid's uniform. Panic is a tactical failure, Sigrid replied softly, her gray eyes fixed on the drone hovering exactly 20 feet above them. Besides, if I panicked every time you did something reckless, I would have burned out a long time ago. Zoya felt a sudden flare of heat in her cheeks, entirely unrelated to the geothermal vents warming the concrete. She opened her mouth to shoot back a witty remark, but the drone finally drifted away, its spotlight scanning the adjacent block. Move! Sigrid commanded. They broke from the alcove and sprinted toward the edge of the sector. Ahead of them lay the boundary perimeter, a massive steel barricade heavily guarded by automated turrets and enforcer patrols. Beyond the gate was the corporate transit line. the only fast route up to the central broadcast tower. "How are we getting past the gate?" Zoya asked, crouching behind a discarded cargo crate. "My fake identification chips are good, but they will not hold up against a level 5 retinal scan." Sigrid pulled a sleek black security tablet from her coat pocket. "They will not need to. I am overriding the gate's local network. I will open the maintenance hatch on the far side for exactly 15 seconds. You will run on my mark." "What about you?" Zoya demanded, her brow furrowing. "You cannot just walk through the main checkpoint without them realizing you are abandoning your post." "I am the chief of security," Sigrid said, her voice dripping with absolute authority. "I go where I please. I will create a distraction to draw their optics away from the hatch. Just make sure you are inside." Before Zoya could argue, Sigrid stepped out from behind the cover of the crate. She strode confidently toward the floodlit checkpoint, her boots clicking sharply against the ice. Zoya held her breath, watching as 4 heavily armed enforcers instantly snapped to attention, raising their rifles before recognizing the silver insignia on her coat. Sigrid barked a harsh order, pointing toward a distant alleyway. 2 of the enforcers nodded and broke into a run, while the others turned to monitor the perimeter cameras. It was a flawless diversion. A green light blinked twice on the heavy iron maintenance hatch to Zoya's left. The 15-second countdown had begun. Zoya lunged forward, keeping her profile low as she darted across the open ground. 10 seconds. Her boots slipped slightly on a patch of black ice, but she caught her balance. 5 seconds. She reached the heavy door, grabbed the frozen handle, and yanked it open, throwing herself into the dark corridor beyond. She rolled onto the grated metal floor just as the heavy door hissed shut behind her, plunging her into pitch blackness. She lay there for a moment, catching her breath, waiting for the sound of Sigrid opening the door from the other side. But the door did not open. Instead, the emergency lights flickered to life, bathing the narrow corridor in a bloody red glow. Zoya slowly pushed herself up off the floor, her heart sinking as she realized she was not alone. Standing at the far end of the corridor, blocking the only exit to the transit line, were 3 Vanguard exterminators. They did not carry stun batons. They carried heavy plasma rifles, and every single barrel was raised as a blinding laser sight locked directly onto Zoya's chest. The 3 laser sights converged over Zoya's heart, painting a deadly cluster of crimson dots against her leather jacket. She slowly raised her hands, keeping her fingers spread wide. Her mind raced, calculating the odds of drawing her stun pistol before they pulled their triggers. The odds were 0. "Target acquired!" The central exterminator buzzed through a vocoder, his voice a distorted mechanical growl. "Preparing for lethal termination and memory retrieval." "Wait," Zoya said, injecting every ounce of false confidence she possessed into her voice. "If you fry me with plasma, the neural drive melts. You will destroy the very data the board wants." The exterminators paused, their visors tilting as they processed the logic. It was a bluff. The implant was shielded against thermal damage, but Vanguard foot soldiers were not paid to think critically. They were paid to follow protocols. That momentary hesitation was exactly what Zoya needed, but she still lacked an escape route. Suddenly, a deafening screech of feedback ripped through the narrow corridor. The exterminators flinched, clutching their helmets as their internal communication feeds were hijacked. Before they could recover, the heavy bulkhead door directly behind them violently blew off its hinges. Thick white smoke poured into the corridor. Through the haze stepped Sigrid. She did not have a plasma rifle. She had a heavy riot shotgun, and her usually immaculate silver-trimmed coat was dusted with concrete powder. Without a word, she raised the weapon and fired twice. The concussive blasts were deafening in the enclosed space. The non-lethal kinetic rounds slammed into the backs of the two nearest exterminators, sending them crashing into the grated floor. The third exterminator spun around, leveling his weapon at Sigrid. Zoya moved. She lunged forward, sliding across the metal grating on her knees. She grabbed the barrel of the falling exterminator's plasma rifle and shoved it upward just as the third guard pulled the trigger. A blinding bolt of blue energy seared into the ceiling, showering them all in sparks. Zoya kicked the back of the guard's knee, sending him buckling forward. Sigrid stepped in seamlessly, bringing the heavy stock of her shotgun down hard against the base of his helmet. He collapsed in a heap of black armor. Silence rushed back into the corridor, broken only by the hiss of melting metal from the ceiling. Zoya stayed on her knees for a second, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She looked up at Sigrid. The chief of security stood tall amidst the smoke, her chest heaving slightly, her jaw clenched tight. She offered Zoya a gloved hand. "I told you I would create a distraction," Sigrid said, though her voice lacked its usual icy composure. It sounded strained, laced with a raw edge of adrenaline. Zoya took her hand, letting Sigrid pull her to her feet. Their bodies brushed together, and this time, neither of them pulled away immediately. Zoya could feel the heat radiating off the taller woman. "Blowing up a bulkhead is not a distraction," Zoya breathed, staring up into those intense gray eyes. "That is an act of war." "Vanguard forced my hand," Sigrid murmured, her gaze dropping for a fraction of a second to Zoya's lips before snapping back to her eyes. "They updated the security protocols while I was at the checkpoint. They know I am rogue. We have less than 10 minutes before this entire sub-level is sealed and flooded with neurotoxin." Zoya swallowed hard, the brief moment of intimacy shattering. "Then we need to reach the transit car now." They sprinted over the unconscious bodies, bursting through the smoke and into the cavernous transit station. The magnetic rail line gleamed under the pale yellow station lights. A sleek, silver transport car sat idle at the platform, its doors wide open. It was their only ticket up to the central broadcast tower, rising miles above the freezing city. But as they dashed across the platform, the station's warning sirens began to wail. A mechanical voice echoed from the overhead speakers, announcing the total lockdown of Sector 4. "Get in!" Sigrid shouted, shoving Zoya through the sliding doors of the transit car. Sigrid leaped in right behind her, slapping her palm against the emergency manual override panel. The heavy glass doors began to slide shut. Outside on the platform, a fresh squad of enforcers burst from the stairwell, raising their rifles. The doors were only inches from closing when a metallic wedge suddenly jammed between the glass panels, halting them with a sickening crunch. Zoya watched in horror as thick, mechanical fingers gripped the edge of the door, slowly and deliberately forcing the glass apart. Through the widening gap, staring directly at them with glowing optic sensors, was a fully armored mechanized sentry hound, and its reinforced steel jaw was unhinging as it prepared to leap. The mechanical beast launched itself through the opening, its steel claws tearing deep gouges into the floor paneling. Sigrid threw herself in front of Zoya, bringing the heavy barrel of her shotgun up to block the snapping jaws. Metal ground against metal with a horrific screech. The sentry hound drove Sigrid backward, pinning her against the far wall of the carriage. Zoya did not hesitate. She drew her stun pistol, but shooting the heavy armor plating would be entirely useless. She needed a vulnerable target. She dove toward the struggling mass of steel and limbs, wedging her arm right beside the snapping jaws of the hound. She jammed the barrel of her pistol directly into the glowing red optic sensor and held down the trigger. A massive surge of blue voltage flooded the machine's neural processor. The hound convulsed violently, its limbs locking up before it collapsed sideways onto the floor, smoking and lifeless. Zoya kicked the heavy metallic wedge free from the door track. The glass panels hissed shut, sealing them inside just as a barrage of plasma fire scorched against the reinforced exterior. The transit car lurched violently, pinning Zoya against the back wall as the magnetic engines roared to life. They shot upward, leaving the chaos of the station far below as they began their rapid ascent toward the towering skyline. Zoya slid down the wall until she hit the floor, her chest heaving. She looked across the carriage at Sigrid. The chief of security was slumped against the opposite wall, holding her left arm. A deep gash had torn through her silver-trimmed sleeve, leaving a streak of dark red against the pristine white fabric. "You are bleeding," Zoya said, her voice shaking slightly as the adrenaline began to fade. "It is just a scratch from the plating," Sigrid muttered, trying to wave her off. Zoya ignored the protest. She crawled across the vibrating floor of the carriage and kneeled beside Sigrid. Without asking, Zoya gently took Sigrid's injured arm in her hands. She unzipped an interior pocket of her leather jacket, pulled out a small, sterile bandage, and began to wrap the wound with careful, steady hands. Sigrid watched her in silence, the icy exterior finally melting away, to reveal something fiercely vulnerable underneath. "You could have run when it pinned me," Sigrid whispered, her breath ghosting over Zoya's forehead. "I told you we have a deal," Zoya replied softly, smoothing the fabric over the bandage. She looked up, and suddenly there was no space left between them. The deafening hum of the magnetic rails faded into the background. Zoya could feel the unmistakable pull of Sigrid's gaze, drawing her in. Sigrid reached up with her uninjured hand, her leather-clad fingers gently brushing a stray curl away from Zoya's face. Zoya leaned into the touch, her heart hammering a completely different rhythm now. She closed the distance, her lips pressing against Sigrid's. It was a desperate, electric kiss, tasting of ash and pure, reckless survival. Sigrid kissed her back with a fierce intensity that left Zoya completely breathless, her hand tangling deeply in Zoya's dark hair. But the fragile moment shattered instantly. The entire transit car shuddered with a massive impact, throwing them both hard against the metal floor. The overhead lights snapped off, plunging them into total darkness as the steady hum of the magnetic engines died completely. They were suspended thousands of feet above the frozen city, and directly above their heads, the blinding spark of a heavy plasma torch began to slowly slice its way through the reinforced ceiling of the carriage. Sparks rained down like a waterfall of liquid fire, illuminating the dark carriage in blinding flashes of orange and white. Zoya scrambled backward, pulling Sigrid with her until their backs hit the locked doors. "Assault team!" Sigrid yelled over the screech of melting metal. She checked the chamber of her riot shotgun, her jaw set tight. "They must have deployed from a dropship. When that panel falls, we will have roughly 2 seconds before they flood the cabin with concussive grenades." "I only have 3 charges left in my pistol," Zoya said, wiping a streak of soot from her cheek. She could still feel the phantom warmth of Sigrid's lips on hers, a stark contrast to the freezing draft now pouring into the broken carriage. There was no time to talk about what had just happened. They simply shared a single, intense look that promised they would discuss it in detail if they survived the next 5 minutes. "Stay behind me," Sigrid commanded, her grip tightening on her weapon. The glowing circle in the ceiling was nearly complete. With a final, ear-splitting crack, the heavy metal plate was kicked inward. It crashed heavily onto the floor of the carriage. Instantly, 2 metallic canisters dropped through the hole, bouncing wildly against the grated floor. "Down!" Sigrid shoved Zoya to the deck and threw her own body over her. The grenades detonated with a blinding flash and a shock wave that rattled Zoya's teeth. Her ears rang with a high-pitched whine, but the heavy fabric of Sigrid's coat had shielded her from the worst of the blast. Before the smoke could even begin to clear, 2 Vanguard drop commandos plummeted through the opening, rappelling down on magnetic tethers. They were clad in heavy tactical armor, their visors glowing an eerie green in the dark. Sigrid rolled off Zoya and fired her shotgun directly upward. The blast caught the first commando in the chest before his boots even touched the floor, sending him violently crashing back into the jagged edge of the ceiling. The second commando hit the deck rolling. He brought a compact submachine gun up, sweeping the barrel toward Sigrid. Zoya pushed herself up from the floor, lunging at the commando's legs. She tackled him hard around the knees, throwing his aim off just enough that his volley of bullets tore into the reinforced glass window instead of Sigrid's chest. The commando grunted, kicking Zoya squarely in the ribs. The breath left her lungs in a painful rush, and she fell backward, her stun pistol skittering across the floor. The commando raised his weapon to finish her off. A deafening roar filled the cabin as Sigrid closed the distance, using the heavy barrel of her shotgun like a club to smash the weapon out of his hands. He recovered instantly, drawing a serrated combat blade from his hip. He slashed blindly, the blade catching the collar of Sigrid's coat and tearing the fabric. Zoya forced herself to her feet, ignoring the sharp pain in her side. She spotted her stun pistol lying near the open blast hole. She dove for it, sliding across the soot-covered metal. Her fingers closed around the grip just as the commando drove his knee into Sigrid's stomach, knocking the air out of the chief of security. Zoya aimed carefully and fired her second-to-last charge. The blue bolt struck the commando right in the exposed joint of his neck armor. He convulsed wildly and dropped to the floor like a stone. Zoya scrambled over to Sigrid, grabbing her arm and hauling her upright. "Are you okay?" "I am fine," Sigrid gasped, leaning heavily on her shotgun to catch her breath. Suddenly, the entire transit car groaned. The heavy emergency brakes that had kept them suspended on the track began to screech loudly, throwing sparks outside the shattered windows. The magnetic locks were failing. The car lurched downward, dropping a sickening 10 feet before catching abruptly, throwing them both to their knees. "The dropship must have severed the main suspension cables," Sigrid said, her voice tight with a rare trace of panic. "The car is detaching from the rail." Zoya looked out the shattered window. They were level with a massive maintenance platform jutting out from the central broadcast tower, but it was at least 12 feet away. A terrifying drop into the abyss waited below. Another horrible metallic screech echoed through the shaft, and the transit car tilted violently forward, preparing to plunge completely. "We have to jump!" Zoya screamed, grabbing Sigrid tightly by the hand and dragging her toward the broken window as the floor beneath them finally gave way. Gravity seized them. Zoya threw all her weight forward, launching herself and Sigrid through the shattered glass just as the transit car plummeted into the endless, freezing abyss below. The wind roared in Zoya's ears, a physical force tearing at her clothes. For one terrifying second, they were completely airborne, suspended between the falling wreckage and the rusted steel grating of the maintenance platform. Zoya hit the edge hard. The breath exploded from her lungs as her ribs slammed against the icy metal. Her hands scrabbled desperately for purchase on the frost-covered grating, but her leather gloves slipped. She began to slide backward into the void. A hand clamped around her wrist like a vice. Sigrid lay flat on the platform above her, her face pale with agony. She had caught Zoya with her wounded left arm, the torn silver fabric now entirely soaked in dark blood. Sigrid's boots scraped against the metal as Zoya's dangling weight threatened to drag them both over the edge. "Hold on," Sigrid grunted through clenched teeth, the muscles in her jaw standing out in sharp relief. "Let me go!" Zoya yelled, the roaring wind stealing her words. "You cannot hold me with that arm!" "I said," Sigrid roared, her gray eyes blazing with absolute defiance. "Hold on!" With a sheer, impossible display of willpower, Sigrid dragged herself backward, pulling Zoya up inch by agonized inch, until Zoya could finally hook her leg over the railing and roll onto the solid steel deck. They collapsed together against the frozen grating, chests heaving, surrounded by the howling gale of the high atmosphere. Zoya pushed herself up onto her elbows. Sigrid was lying beside her, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. Without a single thought for the freezing wind, Zoya crawled over, pulling off her own scarf, and pressing it firmly against the bleeding gash on Sigrid's arm to stem the flow. Sigrid looked up at her, a faint, exhausted smile touching her lips. "I told you, I would not let you fall." Zoya leaned down, pressing her forehead against Sigrid's, uncaring about the biting cold or the danger they were still in. "You are the most stubborn woman in Neo-Reykjavik," Zoya whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of terror and profound relief. "It is a required trait for executive management," Sigrid replied softly. She reached up with her good hand, cupping the back of Zoya's neck and pulling her down for a brief, fierce kiss. It was a promise, a tether holding them together in the storm, hot and desperate against the freezing rain. "Come on," Zoya said, pulling away reluctantly, but keeping her hand intertwined with Sigrid's. "We need to get inside before we freeze to death, or before they send another dropship." She helped the taller woman to her feet. The towering black spire of the central broadcast antenna loomed directly above them, piercing the heavy storm clouds. A massive blast door marked the entrance to the terminal room. Zoya approached the control panel, pulling a specialized decryption tool from her belt. It took her exactly 45 seconds to bypass the lock. The heavy steel doors groaned and slid apart, revealing a cavernous, dimly lit control center, filled with humming server racks and a massive central console overlooking the city below. They stepped inside, the blast doors sealing shut behind them to block out the roaring wind. "The uplink is right there," Zoya said, pointing to the primary terminal. She tapped the neural port behind her ear. "Once I connect, the data broadcasts to every public screen and personal device in the city. Vanguard will not be able to scrub it." She stepped toward the console, pulling the interface cable from her collar. But before she could insert the jack into the terminal, the overhead emergency lights suddenly flared to a blinding intensity. A slow, rhythmic clapping echoed from the shadows on the far side of the room. From the darkness stepped a tall woman wearing a flawless white suit, flanked by 4 heavily augmented Praetorian guards. Their weapons were already drawn and perfectly aimed at Zoya's chest. "Bravo, Sigrid," the woman said, her voice smooth and dripping with venom. "I always knew your misplaced sense of morality would be your undoing, but I never expected you to drag a street rat up here to finish the job." Sigrid froze. her grip tightening on her empty shotgun as she stared at the chief executive officer of Vanguard Dynamics. "Step away from the console, Zoya," the executive commanded, raising a sleek silver pistol and pressing the barrel directly against the temple of a battered, bound figure she dragged forward from the shadows. The very underworld buyer who had failed to meet Zoya at the tavern exactly 2 hours ago. Zoya felt the blood drain from her face. The man kneeling on the floor was Tariq, one of the most reliable information brokers in the lower sectors. His face was heavily bruised, and a thin line of blood trickled from his split lip, but his eyes were wide with sheer terror as he stared at her. "Director Isolde," Sigrid said, her voice remarkably steady despite her exhaustion and the heavy loss of blood. "This does not need to end in a massacre. The executive board is acting illegally. You are orchestrating the murder of millions to preserve your profit margins." "I am preserving the future of this city," Isolde replied smoothly, her grip on the silver pistol unwavering. "The geothermal core is dying, Sigrid. We have exactly 4 months of power left before the outer domes collapse and the cold claims us all. Purging the lower sectors is not malice. It is simple, unavoidable arithmetic." Zoya stared at the terminal console, calculating the physical distance between the data jack in her hand and the blinking access port. 3 feet. Under the concentrated aim of 4 heavily armed Praetorian guards, it might as well have been 3 miles. "Let Tariq go," Zoya said, keeping her voice low and even, masking the rapid beating of her heart. "He knows absolutely nothing about the contents of the memory file. He just brokered the meeting." Isolde laughed, a sharp, crystalline sound that echoed through the cavernous room and held absolutely no warmth. "Oh, Zoya, I know exactly what he knows. I did not bring him here for an interrogation. I brought him here as a motivational tool." Isolde pressed the barrel of the pistol harder against Tariq's temple. He let out a muffled whimper. "Step completely away from the console and drop the interface cable, or I will paint this server rack with his memories." Zoya looked at Tariq. He squeezed his eyes shut, trembling violently against the cold floor. Then she looked at Sigrid. The chief of security stood perfectly still, her stormy gray eyes locked onto Zoya. Slowly, deliberately, Sigrid gave her a nearly imperceptible nod, a silent, desperate command. "Do not surrender." Zoya slowly lowered her hand, letting the interface cable dangle by her side. "Fine," she said, raising both of her empty hands in a gesture of defeat. "You win, Isolde. Just do not pull the trigger." "A predictably emotional choice," Isolde purred, her lips curling into a cruel smile. "Guards, secure the memory broker and prepare her for surgical extraction. And kill the traitor." The 2 Praetorian guards on the left immediately shifted their heavy rifles, locking their sights directly onto Sigrid's chest. Zoya moved with explosive speed. She did not lunge for the data access port. Instead, she threw her entire body weight backward, bringing her heavy, steel-toed boot down violently onto the primary cooling junction box built into the floor directly beneath the humming server racks. Pressurized coolant burst outward in a thick, blinding cloud of freezing white vapor, simultaneously triggering a catastrophic short circuit in the main power relay. Sparks exploded in a massive shower of electrical fire, and the entire terminal room was instantly plunged into absolute pitch-black darkness. The deafening roar of plasma fire erupted, tearing through the metal server racks exactly where Zoya had been standing a fraction of a second before, while the frantic shouts of the guards echoed through the chaos as Zoya blindly lunged through the dark to find Sigrid. Zoya crashed into a heavy server rack, her shoulder screaming in pain, but she pushed off it immediately. The freezing vapor coated her throat with every desperate breath. Blindly, her hands swept through the pitch blackness, searching the floor where Sigrid had just been standing. A blinding flash of plasma fire illuminated the room for a fraction of a second. In that strobe of deadly blue light, Zoya saw Sigrid dropping low, sweeping the legs of a towering Praetorian guard. The massive soldier hit the ground with a thunderous crash, his heavy rifle clattering away into the dark. Zoya threw herself forward, her hand finally closing around the familiar, blood-soaked fabric of Sigrid's silver coat. "I have you!" Zoya hissed, pulling the taller woman close. The air around them practically vibrated with the chaotic crossfire as the remaining guards shot wildly into the hissing vapor. "The console," Sigrid breathed directly into Zoya's ear, her voice rough but entirely focused. "I will draw their fire toward the eastern wall. You crawl back to the terminal and initiate the broadcast. Do not wait for me." "I am not leaving without you!" Zoya fired back, gripping Sigrid's good arm tightly. "You will not have to," Sigrid replied. In the darkness, Zoya felt the briefest, softest press of Sigrid's lips against her temple. It was a fleeting anchor in the absolute madness. "Now, go!" Sigrid tore away, plunging back into the mist. A moment later, Zoya heard the sickening crunch of metal striking armor, followed instantly by Sigrid shouting a sharp command to draw the guards away. Heavy boots pounded across the grated floor as the Praetorians redirected their fire, chasing the sound of their former commanding officer. Zoya dropped flat against the floor. She crawled frantically, dragging her bruised body over shattered glass and tangled wires. The hissing coolant made the floor slick, but it also masked the sound of her movements. She reached out, her fingers finally brushing the smooth, metal base of the primary terminal. She pulled herself up just enough to reach the control deck. Her hands fumbled in the dark, tracing the edge of the console until she found the recessed access port. Her hands were shaking violently now, numb from the freezing vapor. She grabbed the interface cable dangling from her collar. "Come on," she whispered to herself, guiding the metal jack into the slot. With a sharp click, the connection locked into place. Instantly, the terminal screen flared to life, casting a stark, pale blue glow across Zoya's face. The data transfer initiated automatically, pulling the encrypted files directly from her neural drive. A status indicator flashed on the screen reading 10% complete. 20% complete. "She is at the terminal," a voice roared from the shadows. Zoya turned her head just in time to see Director Isolde emerging from the dissipating vapor. The executive's pristine white suit was scorched, but her aim was perfectly steady. She raised the silver pistol, aiming directly at the pulsing neural port locked securely behind Zoya's left ear. And her finger tightened heavily on the trigger just as a massive explosion rocked the foundation of the broadcast tower, violently throwing the entire room sideways. Director Isolde stumbled, her silver pistol firing blindly into the air. The heavy caliber bullet shattered the glass panel exactly 2 inches above Zoya's head, raining deadly shards across her shoulders. Zoya squeezed her eyes shut, gripping the edge of the console with both hands. She refused to let go. The terminal screen flashed brightly as the upload hit 50%. The neural drain was excruciating, pulling the massive, encrypted files from her mind like a physical weight being dragged through her skull. Through the dissipating white vapor, Sigrid lunged. Her silver coat was torn to shreds, her face was bruised, and her left arm was soaked in blood. But she moved with the unstoppable force of a falling avalanche. She slammed directly into Isolde, sending the executive crashing onto the steel grating. The silver pistol flew from Isolde's grip, skittering over the edge of the platform and dropping into the freezing abyss below. The two remaining Praetorian guards instantly recovered their footing, raising their heavy plasma rifles toward Sigrid. But before their fingers could even touch the triggers, a deafening harmonic chime echoed throughout the entire dome. The terminal screen directly in front of Zoya flashed a blinding emerald green. The progress bar read 100%. The file was unleashed. Instantly, every single digital billboard, every personal communication tablet, and every transit monitor across the sprawling metropolis of Neo-Reykjavik lit up with Vanguard Dynamics classified blueprints. The undeniable truth of the imminent core meltdown, the hoarded power reserves, and the calculated genocide of the lower sectors was broadcast directly into the hands of millions of citizens. The Praetorian guards froze. Their own tactical helmet displays were suddenly projecting the horrific data. One guard slowly lowered his rifle, his hands shaking as he realized his own family in Sector 4 had been marked for termination by the very executives he was sworn to protect. He looked at his partner, who was already stepping backward, refusing to defend a corporation that had just condemned them all. Isolde pushed herself up on her elbows, staring in absolute horror at the glowing screens surrounding the terminal. Her pristine empire was crumbling in real time. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the sound of Tariq, bleeding but unbroken, stepping forward from the shadows to clamp a heavy pair of magnetic security cuffs around the executive's wrists. Zoya reached up with trembling fingers and yanked the interface cable from her neural port. The sudden disconnect sent a massive wave of dizziness crashing over her. The adrenaline that had kept her moving finally evaporated, and her knees gave out completely. She did not hit the floor. Strong, familiar arms wrapped tightly around her waist, catching her before she could fall. Zoya leaned her head back against Sigrid's shoulder, letting out a long, ragged breath. She closed her eyes, breathing in the scent of smoke, rain, and bergamot. "It is done," Sigrid whispered, burying her face in Zoya's dark curls. Her voice was thick with emotion, stripped of all its former corporate coldness. "You saved the city." "We saved the city," Zoya corrected softly, slowly turning around in Sigrid's arms. She looked up at the former chief of security. The stoic, icy exterior of the terrifying enforcer was gone completely, replaced by something profoundly warm, fiercely protective, and entirely devoted. Sigrid looked down at her with a tenderness that made Zoya's heart ache in the best possible way. Zoya reached up, gently resting her bare hand against Sigrid's bruised cheek. Sigrid leaned into the touch, closing her eyes for a brief moment before leaning down. Their lips met in a kiss that was no longer driven by the desperate fear of death, but by the quiet, beautiful promise of tomorrow. It was slow, deep, and perfectly real. They walked out onto the maintenance platform together, their hands firmly intertwined, leaving the ruined control room and the shattered corporation behind them. Far below, the neon lights of Neo-Reykjavik burned brighter than ever before, painting the endless winter night in brilliant shades of gold and violet. The city was finally awake. The frozen chains of corruption were broken forever. And as Zoya stood wrapped securely in the arms of the woman she loved, looking out over the endless horizon, she knew she had finally found a place to call home.